Welcome, engineers. My name's TravisIQ, and today we are answering certification exam questions about security controls, physical, administrative, and technical controls. Let's go! Woo! Join me in the void as we begin this discussion of exam questions. First question on the docket. IntelliGenceQuest, a technology consulting firm, recently updated its cybersecurity policies to enhance user authentication security. A senior Active Directory engineer implemented a new policy requiring all employees to change their passwords every 90 days and enforce complexity rules such as a mix of uppercase, numbers, and special characters. Okay, so first and foremost, like you've heard me say before, let's look at the question. Active Directory, cybersecurity policies, passwords every 90 days and enforce complexity rules. Now I need to think about, there's a lot going on here, right? There's timing, there's a policy denotation, there's Active Directory, there's engineering and relative seniority of these engineers, a mix of criteria. So what are they asking me for? What are we actually asking here? Which type of cybersecurity control is IntelliGenceQuest utilizing based upon the information that has been given here? And interestingly enough, I really like this question because if you look, there's a lot of extraneous information here. But there's one thing that I told you in the previous video, if you haven't seen that, go take a look at it as I describe these controls, is the control is important, but how it is implemented is also extremely important. So in this case, this technology firm recently updated its cybersecurity policies to enhance user authentication security. So everything that comes after this, right, is showing what that security policy is reflecting. So now they're describing, hey, we implemented a policy and an engineer then went in, this senior engineer implemented a new policy requiring all employees to change their passwords. Okay, so there was a higher level policy. Now, this is really weird, right? So policies and policy, but they're used in two different contexts here, right? Cybersecurity policy is documentation, and so they're saying we changed our documentation to reflect, and now an engineer is doing this thing. And so if I said we changed a policy to reflect and then we need to update what we're doing, I would be talking about an administrative control. That's what administrative controls are. They are policies, or they are written procedures, or they are guidelines that say we need to do certain things. But they actually went one step further in this question, and they said, not only have I suggested a policy, but now I am also describing what the senior engineer, the senior level engineer, is doing. And so if I'm describing what the senior level engineer is doing, then I'm more than likely actually giving you a technical control. I'm giving you a technical description. And so now I need to say, hey, is there a technical description here? The Active Directory engineer is implementing policies requiring employees to change their password every 90 days. This is something that's really unique to this question and something that you would likely see and might trip you up. Active Directory calls their technical controls policies. A password reuse policy, a complexity policy. When you implement that policy in Active Directory, that is what is technically enforcing those descriptions or those requirements on those passwords, for example. And so in this case, they've used two terms of policies in two different ways. And the second sentence, which is describing what's actually going on here, is superseding the original sentence, because the original sentence said, hey, we're doing this thing, and this is what happened. And so in this case here, this policy is actually a technical control by the definition within Active Directory. And you might say, well, Travis, that's really confusing. And I would say to you, that's cybersecurity sometimes. And the way that we would implement these questions is in the most confusing way to require you to have all of that rote knowledge. So if you don't have the baseline knowledge of engineer seniority and what the senior engineer is doing, if you don't have that baseline knowledge of the terminology associated with Active Directory, and if you then don't have that knowledge, then you can only go on the words and definitions that you know, which is the policy that is described above. So in this case, it's actually not an administrative control. And if you've seen me do these before, you know that I like to also define the answer and why the others aren't correct. Obviously, we're not talking about physical controls here. And there really hasn't been anything associated with compliance, GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. So there really has been no additional definitions here for physical controls or compliance controls. I already told you why it isn't an administrative control, and that leaves us with C, technical control. So in this case, the answer is C, because it's describing a technical control that is implemented in Active Directory by an engineer. Stella C LLC hired a penetration tester to assess its security defenses. And you're like, Travis, penetration tester? I thought this was a cybersecurity question, not this offensive cybersecurity or penetration testing exam. Give me a second here. We're going to read through the question. As part of the assessment, the tester was tasked with attempting to gain unauthorized access to Stella C's server room. The tester successfully bypassed security cameras, tailgated an employee through a badge-restricted door, and accessed a secured area without proper authorization, probably as a result of tailgating this employee. So now we've seen a lot of things here. We've seen penetration testing. We've seen the company hiring individuals to do this and test security and defenses. We've seen some security and defenses identified with security cameras, tailgating, and unauthorized access to a physical infrastructure. Which type of security control now was the penetration tester evaluating? So now we're saying, yes, the pen tester was hired and there were some goals for Stella C, but we're actually asking which controls was the tester evaluating? Which controls did they bypass? Not only does it not just ask, it doesn't just come out and say which controls did they bypass, what types of controls. It says which controls were they evaluating? They bypassed these controls. Those are the controls that this penetration tester was evaluating. So if we come down to the security controls, this is not an administrative control, obviously. There's no policy descriptions here. And realistically, for the most part, your penetration tests aren't going to be strictly testing administrative controls, although there are some unique scenarios where you may see this observed. We're not going to go into it here. A detective control. Interestingly enough, some of these are detective controls described. But they are not all detective controls. Tailgating through a badge-restricted door. Is a badge-restricted door explicitly a detective control? Can a badge-restricted door detect when someone is going through it that is unauthorized? Maybe, maybe not. But there's no detective component there. You either badge in and you get through, or you don't. Gaining access to a physically secured area, an unauthorized access to an area. Maybe there was a detective control, maybe there wasn't. So that's why there are 3 components that the penetration tester is being described as having bypassed. So maybe one of those controls is a detective control. But are all 3 of them detective controls? No. So I would argue that there's probably a better answer here, and in fact there is. We have technical controls. Are any of these controls defined in software? You could argue that badge restriction, maybe there's some software component to the physical badge that you badge into, but realistically it's a physical door that is being bypassed via tailgating. And so technical controls don't really fall into this criteria either. That leaves us with physical controls. Now, what have we discussed here? Bypassing security cameras, physically observing an infrastructure, tailgating through a door, gaining access to a physical infrastructure without proper authorization. All 3 of these fall within the domain of the physical control, whereas only one of them realistically falls within the domain of the detective control. So you see here, even in these scenarios where a detective control is described, and I'll go over detective and deterrent controls in a subsequent video, but I haven't necessarily discussed it in this series, but a detective control is a control that is actually detecting instances of malfeasance or bad actors. You could have a physical control that is detective, like a security camera. You could also have intrusion detection systems, IDSs, or some of these other detective controls that are software based as well. But only one of those fell within that criteria. 3 were given. 3 fell within that criteria for the physical control. So in this case, the answer is actually B. We've got a CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. Interestingly enough, a lot of these questions will actually look like this. They won't even have this. It'll just say CISO, right? And you'll have to know that's a Chief Information Security Officer of Groundbreaking Corp. Has decided to strengthen the company's cybersecurity posture by implementing new security measures. As a part of this initiative, the CISO requires all employees to undergo regular anti-phishing training, adhere to strict cybersecurity policies, and comply with a mandatory incident response reporting process for suspected security breaches. Which type of security control is the CISO implementing? Okay, now We don't see any physical controls, number one. So we can rule this out. Corrective controls. I haven't described corrective controls in any of my subsequent videos. This will be in the detective control video as well. But a corrective control is a control that's implemented after something has occurred and you are trying to correct a security issue that is persistent. And so none of these describe something that, or we don't know, so we couldn't ascribe it to a corrective control. You might say, Travis, this is where if you have a lot of knowledge, you might say, a lot of times the CISO is going to do this as a corrective control because we had a breach or an incident and someone didn't report it and it was a result of phishing. You're absolutely right. I would say take your tinfoil hat off as your regular cybersecurity job and think discreetly about what the question has given you for information. What I did there when I gave you that info is I abstracted away some information from the question. I gave you the question and I gave some abstraction that said, well, actually, it's probably like this. It probably is like that. The CISO probably is administering these as a part of a corrective control. But that's not the information that you were given. You can only operate on the information that was given in the question. So it's not a corrective control because it hasn't described it as such. Finally, this leaves us with technical and administrative controls. They really haven't described any technical controls here. Maybe a strict cybersecurity policy, if you remember one of the previous questions above, for Active Directory, it might be describing Active Directory policies. Again, I'm abstracting away here from what was actually given in the question. I'm well aware that there are no technical controls described here. This policy is written. The training, the anti-phishing training is not a technical control, and mandatory incident response reporting is not a technical control. So this doesn't fall within the technical control range. The only thing that's valid here is an administrative control. And you might say, Travis, it doesn't really say anything about policies requiring. Remember I said this keyword policy is oftentimes a good indicator, but they've left this out intentionally. And they've given you 3 controls that don't apply at all, and one that applies pretty well, actually. I'd say you're about 90% of the way there with this control, and as a result, this has to be the answer. There are no other answers that even describe this with any degree of certainty. Back to trusty IntelliQ. IntelliQ, a technology consulting firm, wants to enhance cybersecurity measures to protect sensitive client data. The company's IT department decides to implement measures such as firewalls, intrusion detection systems, IDS, probably is what's going to be put in here in an exam question to make you think more, and encryption protocols to safeguard information from unauthorized access. And you're like, encryption protocols, weren't they already implementing encryption protocols? Maybe it was legacy technology. Maybe it was technical debt left over from previous administrations 15 years ago, for example. Does this happen? It happens all the time. Just ask Zoom, if you remember those security incidents from Zoom in 2019, 2020, in those years, if you remember what was going on in those years. Zoom updated their encryption suites as a result of some cybersecurity issues. This happens all the time with companies that you know and love. So IDS, encryption protocols, firewalls, this is a very extensive upgrade, right, from the IT department standpoint. We know that this is not an administrative control. We haven't been given any information here associated with policies. They said they wanted to enhance, but they didn't say they implemented any specific policies. These are not deterrent controls by the strictest definition. There's no real indicator to the outside world that you're implementing firewalls and IDS and advanced encryption suites. And you might say, maybe someone, when they looked at the traffic and tried to decipher it, would understand that it was a different encryption suite. Maybe, but again, what are we doing here that we don't want to do when we answer these questions? Abstracting away the information. So it's not a deterrent control. Another example of a control that I'll go over in a subsequent video. So now we're left with physical and technical controls. There really haven't been any physical controls described here either. A firewall, although it could be a physical piece of gear, the operational component of the firewall is software. It's on relative hardware that can support the software, but it's software. Intrusion detection systems, we just described software. Encryption suites is implemented in software. So it's not physical controls. What does that leave us with? Technical controls. And maybe as I was reading this question, and I've gone through a few more here, you might have already thought this to yourself. But these are describing technical controls implemented in software and with some hardware potentially, but really in software. Firewalls, IDS, advanced encryption suites. These are all descriptions of technical controls. This is a layup, slam dunk, let's do it. The answer is C. That takes us through some really interesting exam questions associated with technical, physical, and administrative controls. I hope you found this interesting. We're going to continue this series. And as is always the case, engineer, break stuff, have fun, let's go!